I had the privilege this week of reading a story to a group of preschoolers in the Jack and Jill preschool. I had arranged it with the staff there, and I went up on a Thursday morning to a room full of preschoolers, and I read the classic, The Very Hungry Caterpillar. You know the story? You read it to your children? You still reading it? It's a rich story. We'll get to that. But I sat down and I read this story to them, and then all of a sudden another story occurred to me. This is not the first time I've read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to a group of young people. In fact, the first time I did it was at the Hollidaysburg Public Library. Aeneas and I had gone to story time. And we loved to go to story time. It was a way of getting out of the house, doing something different, going to hear somebody else read a story, and then playing, right? And while we were playing with the train set, the librarian came over to me and she said, "Will, would you like to do story time today?" Me? Do your story time? She said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, is there any reason?" And she said, "Yes, today I want to read a story in Spanish, and I thought that you might be a good person to do that." She said, "I don't know any Spanish, but I've heard you and your son speaking in Spanish, so I think you would be a good person to do that." And in my mind, I'm like, wait a second, lady. You do know that I don't speak any Spanish, right? My son does, but I don't speak any Spanish. But then I thought, okay, how hard could it be? So I sit in front of about 20 and 30 people, and I get out The Very Hungry Caterpillar in Espanol. And I start to open it, and I go to the first page, and you're thinking children's book, right? The words should be really simple. I should breeze right on through this. And I'm reading this thing, and all of a sudden, those words become Don Quixote. Right? And I'm stumbling and mumbling my way through this, and the whole time I'm like, oh, please, I hope there's not a mom in here who took Spanish at any level in school, because they're probably looking at me going, who is this guy? Who is this guy? And of course, I look to Aeneas being like, Aeneas, please help me. And Aeneas is just, nope. You know? So I make it all the way to the end, and I'm like, wow, I'm such a fraud. But I made it through this story, and I fold it up, and they continue on with their program. And afterwards, as I'm playing with Aeneas, this girl, she must have been, this was during the summertime, so the kids were out of school. She must have been 5th, 6th grade. She came over to me and she said, "That was really cool what you did." She goes, I think I might like to learn Spanish. And all of a sudden, my humiliation, right? What I couldn't do became somebody else's inspiration. That my insecurities, all right, all my mistakes, somehow were taken away. And who knows? Maybe this young person will go on to learn Spanish one day, just through doing this. Why do we tell stories? Why do we tell stories like this? Well, I tell you stories because I'm trying to tell you about something, a moment of realization in my life, where all of a sudden I realize that sometimes it's worth doing something maybe that I'm not good at, I'm insecure about, in order maybe to benefit some good, to help somebody along the way. We tell stories like The Very Hungry Caterpillar because that story itself has a moment of realization where a character changes. The very hungry caterpillar thinks it can just eat whatever it wants, and it eats and it eats and it eats and it eats, and all of a sudden it gets very sick, and it realizes that it can't eat whatever it wants all the time, that actually it's meant to eat just a green leaf, and that's okay. It has that moment of realization, and it has a moment of transformation where the caterpillar goes into a cocoon and all of a sudden bursts out and it's a butterfly? These are what we want out of stories. We tell stories because we want to show what it means to grow, what it means to change, what it means to learn. And that captures our hearts in ways that other ideas simply don't. You never thought of yourself as a very hungry caterpillar, did you? You are. That's what makes it such a good story. And that's why we keep telling stories, so that we can be inspired to change. And just so in our faith, right? We tell stories in our faith. You know it, that you, in front of you right now in your pew, is a storybook, a Bible, a collection of stories. We are part of that tradition, a great storytelling tradition, where people thought, you know what? You know what's the best way to pass on our faith? Isn't through a list of rules or a list of propositions. The best way to pass on the truth about our God is through stories. And Jesus becomes another storyteller in our great tradition. And this morning, I read from the Gospel of Matthew yet another parable, another story that Jesus likes to tell. Some Bible scholars say that Jesus may be told about a third of his message in parables. He's a storyteller. He goes out. He entertains with stories. He teaches with stories. He persuades with stories. He enacts change in people's lives, not by explaining the stories, but just by giving them. And that changes people. There's something really human about storytelling. We get it innately from the time when we were a preschooler. There's something within us. We're hardwired as human beings for stories, for meaning making. Our oldest traditions are people gathered around fires telling stories. That's who we are as human beings. Doesn't it make sense that God, too, would want to connect with us in this way? Paul is very much aware that we are storytelling people. And when Paul writes his letter to the Philippians that Chad read from this morning, he's addressing a very specific problem in the church there in Philippi. You see, there in Philippi, the people are being persuaded to follow another group who think that you should follow Christ in a particular way, and Paul has a problem with their teaching. And rather than Paul trying to use a list of maybe propositions and logic and ideas or facts, Paul decides that he's going to use a little bit of storytelling to try to persuade the people of Philippi why his position, why his way of following Christ is better. And so Chad read it this morning. Paul gives us a list. It's almost like a little biography of sorts of his own story, where he goes through his birth, he talks about his family, he talks about his profession, and he talks about how great he is at it. And he gives us this whole story, and he gets to the point where he says, you know what? I did all these things. I was all these things. And it's all rubbish. It's all rubbish compared to knowing Jesus Christ. That's Paul's story. Now, wait a second, Paul. You talked about all these things, all these gains, as Paul calls it, these achievements, and you say they're rubbish, and now that you know Christ, how did you get from A to B, Paul? We know the before. We know the after. Where's the story? Where's the story here, Paul? Isn't that what we want to know? Don't we want to know how Paul gets from A to B? We're longing to know that. Like, Paul, okay, you got to Jesus, so tell us how. Tell us how you got to that point. You left out the best part. He left out the best part. Did he? How did Paul come to know Jesus? Well, in Acts, if we look elsewhere in the Bible, in Acts, there's a story about Paul and his conversion, where he's traveling Damascus Road, right? And he has that great vision. You know that story? There's a story in Acts. But Acts isn't Paul's point of view. In fact, it's some other person telling Paul's story for him. The truth is that in Paul's letters, Paul doesn't really talk anything about what it was like on the Damascus road. The only example that we really have of what happens to Paul is in the letter to Galatians. Kevin, have you gotten here? I'm sure you have. Chapter 1. In chapter 1, Paul says that he came to a realization of Christ, a revelation of Christ, he says. He had a revelation of Christ. Does that do anything for you? Is that any better? Does that give you a little more detail? Is that still a little too vague? That Paul, he was a certain way, he had a revelation of Christ, and now he has this joy of being a Christian in the way of Jesus. He has a revelation of Christ. Paul reminds us that, in fact, there's magic in a story, and that if you have had an experience of Jesus Christ and you can't quite explain it, you can't quite articulate what it means to have an experience of Jesus Christ, that's okay. Because we have to remember that best part, that part where you meet Jesus on your Damascus road, wherever in your life, sometimes can't be reduced to simple words and to a formula. Because if it could be, if it was just that easy, if everybody's story was the same, why, we would all memorize a few things and we'd all be changed. But we know that's not the way it works. That's not the way story works. See, story honors our freedom. God honors our freedom. And when Paul says that he had a revelation of Jesus Christ, he's opening up to the varieties in which you and I can meet Jesus somewhere on our road. And that's your story. And it's going to be different from my story, and it's going to be different from your story and your story. But it's still your story. And you know what the best part of your story is? It's Jesus. That's the best part of your story. So Paul doesn't leave out the best part. The best part is the experience of Jesus Christ in whichever way you happen to find him along your path. That's the best part of your story. But let me ask you something. Are you leaving it out? Are you leaving out the best part of your story? You're sitting here in a pew. You're watching online somewhere. Are you leaving out the best part of your story to an unbelieving world? Do people know why you're here? Do people know why you've committed your heart to Jesus Christ? Have you told your story? And if you haven't, why aren't you? What's keeping you from that? We're all human. And I want to just say, there are a few easy kind of reasons, let's call them excuses, for not telling the best part of our story, or telling our stories really at all. One reason is it's just too personal. For some of us, it's private information. It's between me and God, and really for nobody else, right? I don't need to worry about telling anybody else. This is just between me and God, and that's okay. So we think it's too personal. We think our stories are too boring. We think they're too boring. There's nothing that really happens in our lives, right? We want action. We want big events. We want to be knocked off our donkeys like Paul in the middle of Damascus Road with blinding lights, booming fire, right? Big changes, something to tell, something like a movie, right? That's the way you want your life to be. And so we think, oh, well, Jesus, God hasn't done anything big in my life, so it's not really worth telling about. It's just kind of boring. You know what I say? I say it's rubbish. I say it's garbage. I say that if you have a simple story of the way in which God has given you the gift of forgiving somebody, that's the most powerful story of all, and you better be telling it. If you have found a way to overcome an addiction in your life, and God saved you from that, could be something simple, could be something ordinary. You better be telling that story, because everybody else in here is living from the same place you are. Ordinary lives where God can enact big changes. So don't think your story's too boring. Your story may be the key to unlocking somebody else's transformation. So it's not too personal, not too boring. And finally, one other excuse that we want to just say out loud, let's just go ahead and say it. We're too embarrassed, frankly. We're too embarrassed to be doing all this Jesus talk about the way that Jesus is the best part of our lives, because really we don't really want other people to know. Other people know about our pasts, and we're too embarrassed to tell our story because, let's face it, other people know us better than ourselves. We don't want to air our dirty laundry out there for other people. They know me. They know that I'm not some saint, so I'm just not going to worry about telling the story. We're embarrassed by that. And you know what the most embarrassing excuse is of all? Can I just be honest with you? Let's just go ahead and say it. For many of us, we're embarrassed because, quite frankly, we don't have a best part. We don't have a best part. We don't have something where we can honestly say that Jesus has made a difference. And that can be embarrassing. But friends, if you find yourself in that place, don't be embarrassed. I invite you to listen to the story of Jesus again. And that means for us as a church that if you have a Jesus difference in your life, if you have a best part, you better be telling it. Because it just might be a way in which somebody else might get their best part. You hear me on that? This morning we're going to do something rather different. In your bulletin, if you go to the very end, you're going to find, Kathy and Heidi are going to be thrilled about this. You can talk to me later after service. We have a good old worksheet. A worksheet in church. Oh, my word. Not quite homework. It can be classwork, if you will, church work, if you will. But listen, friends, why not take a minute of our time to think about what is our story? What is our Jesus story? We want to be a storytelling church. We want to enter into a long tradition where we are unafraid to say what it is, the difference that Jesus has made in our lives. And so this morning we are actually going to do this. If you can find something to write with there in the pew, or you could just think through in your mind, we're going to take about 10 minutes as soon as I'm done with my sermon, and we're going to work through this. Friends, we need storytellers in this church. Our community needs storytellers. And for the next 8 weeks, we're going to invite people in our church, maybe in our community, to come up and share their stories. And maybe it just might be you. So if you find yourself working through this worksheet and you realize you've got a story to tell, come see me. Come see me. One last thing. I know y'all are ready to get working. You're ready to get after it. You know what the biggest truth about the hungry caterpillar is? The hungry caterpillar, he changes from a consumer, something where he just takes in, and he transforms into a pollinator. You know what a pollinator is? That's something that gives back, that creates life. Friends, you as a Christian are not a consumer. You aren't meant to sit in the pew and take in information. You've been created to pollinate, to be a life giver. So think on that. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Mem, would you start our time?